Welcome back to the set of the Talk of Paris in Washington. Our guest is Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, former National Security Advisor of President Jimmy Carter. Dr. Brzezinski, you have seen that France is coming back into NATO. What do you think of the decision of Nicolas Sarkozy? Is it a good thing for transatlantic relationship?
Yes, I think on balance it is. I think it's good for Europe and it's good for America. On the part of France, I think it involves a recognition of the fact that international stability, global stability, requires American participation, and American participation can be most effectively engaged by others through NATO. And France, by going back into NATO, also gains an influence on American policy. At the same time, for America, it requires a recognition of something that Sarkozy has been pushing, which is a more effective, more autonomous European defense capability. But so in a sense, there's a quid pro quo here.
Are the Americans ready to share some of the power in NATO, like giving some generals to the French?
Well, I hope it's more serious than that. I think this central issue has been in the alliance that we have often wanted others to share the burdens, but we have not been all that ready to share decisions. However, the problem with the Europeans has been that the Europeans would like to share in the decisions, but not to share in the burdens. And so we have to find a formula which makes it possible for both of us to do what is necessary. Effective compromise on decisions, but joint participation in the burdens.
But do you see possibly together the building of a European defense and of a new alliance with France in it?
Yes, I think the two are not incompatible, provided there is a shared strategic understanding of what is needed in the world today. Sarkozy has talked, for example, about a European defense force based on contributions from the 6 most important European countries, totaling about 60,000 people, men, women, military. If that comes into being, Europe will become a more serious military strategic player in the world. Right now, Europe is undoubtedly a very important political economic force, but it is not a political strategic force. And I, as an American, would like Europe to be that, and I think American policy in the world will be more intelligent if it is shared with Europeans. But it will only be effective if the burdens are also shared.
Okay, we have a question from Professor André Caspi from the Sorbonne about France and Europe. Let's look at it together.
Monsieur Brzezinski, bonjour. Le nouveau président de la
The new French president, Nicolas Sarkozy, seems to have a better relationship with the United States than his predecessors. How will you keep up that relationship between the US and France? Does France as a country still play an important role in America's foreign affairs, or do you merely consider France as being a part of Europe?
Your answer, please.
Well, we certainly consider France to be an important country. At the same time, we're aware of the fact that France is an important European country. And we're also aware of the fact that France has influence on Berlin, on London, and on other European capitals. And if that influence can be translated into a common European policy, France's influence thereby increases. France, as an isolated European country, obviously would not have that influence. So I don't believe you can separate the two. But we obviously recognize the fact that France has great traditions, great pride, a sense of a global role, and that's all to the good. Because from our point of view, a Europe that plays a global role is what the West needs. In fact, the whole concept of the West today in the world has to be particularly appreciated because it is declining. There's now Asia rising, and if the West is to be an active player in the world scene, it has to be based on American and European cooperation, and France is a critical instrument of developing that cooperation across the Atlantic.
And how do you judge Nicolas Sarkozy as a president?
I think he has taken some really serious, substantive initiatives, even though sometimes his style isn't all that serious.
So?
So I think it's more important to emphasize the former than the latter, and perhaps even adjust eventually the latter to the former.
One question about Vladimir Putin in Russia. Are you preoccupied? Do you believe there might be a new Cold War or so? Or how do you see the evolution of Russia today?
I don't think there's going to be a new Cold War because Russia doesn't have the capacity to wage a Cold War. But Putin clearly has been driven by what might be called an imperial nostalgia. He regrets the collapse of the Soviet Union. He would like to recreate something like an imperial sphere of influence within the space of the former Soviet Union. He bitterly resents the fact that Ukraine wants to be part of the West, sees itself as part of Europe, and aspires to EU membership, perhaps also to NATO membership. He resents the fact that Georgia makes possible the existence of the Baku-Ceyhan pipeline, which gives Europe and the West more generally access to the Caspian, and through the Caspian to Central Asia. He would like to cut that. But I think that Putin, who is intelligent and an effective leader, is essentially a transitional figure. He's the last gasp of the old Soviet elite, the KGB, which was the most privileged elite within the Soviet Union. He's now beginning to disappear. Within 10 years, those around him who also come from the KGB will be gone. And a new generation of Russians, many of them trained in Western universities, will begin to take over. And I think such a Russia will then follow the path that Ukraine is taking, begin to move to the West. And that is good for Russia. That is good for Europe. Ultimately, my historic vision is a Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok, not Europe to the Urals. But if Russia isolates itself, what de Gaulle poetically meant as a European-Russian cooperation could become a tragic but very literal geographic definition of new reality. Namely, if Russia isolates itself and doesn't go to Europe, it might lose east of Urals to their neighbors to the east, particularly the Chinese.
Let's turn to Iraq. What is your exit strategy? John McCain is ready to stay 50 or 100 years until a victory is achieved. What do you say to that, and what is the solution to solve the conflict?
I think if we don't end the war in Iraq, we will not only remain bogged down in Iraq, but there is still the danger that the war will spread, because every war is inherently unpredictable in its consequences. And we could end up being bogged down in Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan. And that would mean the end of a constructive American role in the world, with devastating consequences for global stability, including very much for Europe. So we have to end it. I support the notion of ending the American military presence roughly within a year of the elections. But I also emphasize that the decision militarily to disengage has to be accompanied by a serious political and regional effort to create a framework of mutual understanding and security arrangements for Iraq involving all of Iraq's neighbors, so that the potentially destabilizing consequences, transitional destabilizing consequences of American military disengagement are mitigated by cooperation with all of Iraq's neighbors, and maybe even some further away, like Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, who could provide peacekeeping forces for Iraq. I think we have to have this broader effort to end the war.
But do you think America and the world should wait the next president, or should George Bush act now to really make a decision?
Well, I could easily say yes, he should. But, you know, my ability to influence George Bush is rather limited.
But what should he do today?
Well, the same thing. But the point is, we know, you know, he won't. So it's sort of pointless to discuss that.
So we will have to wait whoever becomes the next president?
Well, whoever, but particularly a Democrat, because Senator McCain has indicated that he basically wishes to continue this conflict until some undefined success. And that success is increasingly similar to the horizon, which is an imaginary line which recedes as you walk towards it. We have been seeking success, quote unquote, in Iraq for 5 years. We have to recognize the fact that our military occupation of Iraq is part of the problem. It's not part of the solution.
Let's hear now a question from Guy Millière, who is the president of Institut Turgot in Paris, about Iraq.
Good afternoon, Mr. Brzezinski. I would like to ask you one question about Iraq. Don't you think that the too fast withdrawal of American troops from Iraq could result in a huge bloodbath and in a victory given to Al-Qaeda? And don't you think that giving a victory to Al-Qaeda could have dire and unexpected consequences for all the Middle East and the world?
Your answer?
I think one has to recognize the fact that Al-Qaeda's ability to operate in Iraq is derived from the fact that many Iraqis, many Iraqis, resent, oppose, and resist the American occupation. There was no Al-Qaeda when we moved into Iraq, and there is no special propensity in Iraq to support Al-Qaeda. Once we are gone, the combination of insurgents, resistance to the American occupation with Al-Qaeda activities will end. Al-Qaeda will be on its own, and the chances are overwhelming that it will be much easier then to eliminate Al-Qaeda in Iraq than if the occupation continues.
All right, but don't you think a fast withdrawal will be seen in the world as a defeat of the United States?
Not if it is accompanied by the political and regional arrangements I have been talking about. Because ultimately all of Iraq's neighbors have a stake in Iraq being stable, because they are potentially vulnerable. And hence they'll be more inclined to cooperate once they know we are prepared to end the occupation. But if we don't end the occupation, it will just fester and continue to be essentially a combat zone, which in the process is destroying Iraq as a country. It's destroying Iraq as a national state. And therefore, the longer the occupation lasts, the more difficult it will be to recreate a stable Iraq.
Do you believe there is a chance of a peace agreement in the Middle East with Israel before the end of 2008?
President Bush keeps saying so. And if he is serious, then he has to take the initiative in seeking it. I happen to believe that if the President of the United States publicly and very seriously became engaged in the peace process, there would be significant movement. So the big question is, will he do something? Merely saying, as he says, that he expects there to be peace is not going to produce peace.
But what should he do?
He should put on the table openly and clearly at least the fundamental framework for a comprehensive peace, which would then have to be negotiated in much more detail.
Is it possible to be done before the end of George Bush's presidency?
Those 4 principles could be enunciated by the president as principles that America supports, the world community would support, public opinions would support in Israel and in Palestine.
And that would be the policy of Barack Obama if he is elected?
I have no idea.
But what would you advise him?
I don't speak for him, and I don't give advice to him publicly on television.
Okay, but that would be a good solution.
Well, that is my personal view. I want to emphasize that.
Some people are suspecting you to be too tough on Israel this time.
Well, if being for peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians and favoring a two-state solution for 30 years is being too tough, so be it.
But should Washington talk with the Hamas?
I think basically yes. Again, that's my personal opinion. But the Hamas is a significant body of the political life of the Palestinians. We should talk to it. We talked to the Likud when Likud was in favor of incorporating all of Palestine into Israel.
Should Barack Obama follow that advice and talk to Hamas?
That would be up to him to decide. I have no idea. I'm just a supporter of Barack Obama, no more than that.
Last question on Iran. What should be done to try to ease the tension and to avoid the war?
I think the United States should propose either bilateral talks based on mutual concessions or bilateral talks without any preconditions or concessions, by which I mean either bilateral talks in which they suspend enrichment, we suspend our sanctions, or alternatively bilateral talks in which they continue to enrich, and we talk to them, but we have the right to terminate the negotiations if they drag them out deliberately.
But today, Iran announced that it has reached the goal of 6,000 centrifuges to produce uranium. It's not a good sign. Is there still a risk of war before the end of George Bush's presidency?
Look, as long as there is a war in Iraq, there's always a possibility. There have been incidents in the Persian Gulf between the British Navy and the Iraqis, between the American Navy and the Iraqis. Something could happen in Iraq. Something could happen in the Persian Gulf. Something could happen here that's blamed on the Iranians. Sure, there's always that possibility.
So are you worried that there might be a war with Iran?
Yes, you cannot entirely exclude that possibility, though I hope it's, not very likely, but you cannot entirely exclude it.
Very last question. How do you see the shock or the big battle between Barack Obama, if he is the candidate of the Democrats, and John McCain? Who will win and why?
I think Obama will win because not only is the war in Iraq very unpopular, but the economy in the United States is in serious, serious trouble. And obviously, the previous administration bears responsibility for these two negative developments. This could be altered if there was some serious international eruption, because then McCain could perhaps benefit from the fact that he has had military experience, he's a war hero, and if there was great psychological anxiety in America, that could be to his benefit. But otherwise, I think the probabilities are higher in favor of Obama.
Dr. Brzezinski, thank you very much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you very much for being on the Talk of Paris. And I will see you next week for a new edition of the program. See you soon.